It's the middle of the night. The room is dark. The clock shows 3:33 a.m. You lie in bed, unable to move. Panic sets in as you realize you're paralyzed. Your heartbeat pounds. You try to call out, but no sound comes. Breathing is a struggle. A shadow shifts. A tall, thin figure looms, gliding closer. Cold sweat trickles down your forehead. The figure stands at the foot of your bed, its eyes piercing through the night. A low sound fills the room. You can't move. The figure bends down, its cold breath on your skin. Suddenly, you jerk awake. The clock reads 3:34 a.m. The room is silent, but the terror lingers. You lie back down, fearing the shadows return. Hi there, Brian here. Welcome back to my channel. If you enjoy my content, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to leave a comment below about your own experiences or thoughts on sleep paralysis. Today, we've got a chilling compilation of 4 videos diving deep into the terrifying world of sleep paralysis. Let's get into it. A glimpse of evil. In the summer of 2012, a young man named Jason and his friends, Mike and Tom, were out exploring their usual hangout spots. They spent their evenings wandering the outskirts of their small town, looking for anything interesting to do. That evening, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the dusty paths and dense bushes that lined their route. As they walked along the familiar trail, joking and pushing each other around, they heard a strange sound coming from one of the nearby bushes. It was a low, guttural hum, unlike anything they had heard before. Jason, always the brave one, decided to investigate. "Probably just a raccoon," he said, but the uncertainty in his voice was clear. The 3 of them approached the bush cautiously. As they got closer, the sound grew louder and more distinct, almost rhythmic. It sent shivers down their spines. Mike grabbed a stick and poked the bush, half expecting something to jump out. Instead, they saw a pair of eyes glinting back at them from the shadows. Before they could react, the thing in the bush emitted a loud, eerie laugh, sending them stumbling backward in fright. They exchanged nervous glances before bursting into laughter, trying to shake off the unease. "Probably some weirdo messing with us," Tom said, trying to sound convincing. They laughed it off and continued on their way, the strange encounter fading into the background of their conversation. By the time Jason got home, it was dark. He brushed off the odd encounter as a random prank, had dinner with his family, and went to bed. But that night, something felt off. He lay in bed, unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched. The room was dark, and the usual sounds of the house settling seemed louder than usual. As Jason drifted into an uneasy sleep, he suddenly felt a heavy pressure on his chest. His eyes shot open, and he realized he couldn't move. Panic set in as he tried to scream, but no sound came out. He heard the same strange sound from earlier that evening, now much closer and more menacing, coming from the foot of his bed. His eyes darted around the room until they locked onto a figure standing beneath his bed. It was the head he had seen in the bush, but now it was clearer, more terrifying. The demonic face grinned at him, the sound growing louder, more insistent. It moved closer, inching its way up his bed, the grin widening as it did. Jason's heart raced as the figure got closer and closer, its eyes burning into his. Just as it was about to reach him, the figure suddenly faded away, and the pressure on his chest lifted. Jason sat up, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. He looked around his room, expecting to see the figure lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. Shaking, he got up and checked every corner of his room, but it was empty. Convincing himself it was just sleep paralysis, he lay back down, though sleep was now impossible. The memory of the figure's eyes and the sound haunted him, leaving him unable to shake the fear that it wasn't just a dream. The next morning, Jason woke up feeling groggy, the memory of the demonic face still vivid in his mind. He tried to shake off the unease as he got ready for the day. His parents noticed his tired eyes and asked if he was all right. "Just had a rough night," Jason mumbled, forcing a smile. They exchanged worried glances but didn't press further. On his way to meet Mike and Tom, Jason couldn't help but feel like he was being watched. The streets seemed quieter than usual, and even the birds chirping sounded distant and eerie. He shrugged off the feeling, blaming it on his lack of sleep. When he arrived at their usual spot, he noticed something odd. The bush where they had seen the eyes was now dead, its leaves withered and brown, despite the summer heat. Jason's heart skipped a beat, but he tried to rationalize it. "Hey, did you guys see that bush?" he asked, pointing it out to Mike and Tom. They shrugged, not seeming to care much. "Maybe someone poured something on it," Tom suggested. They brushed it off and started their usual banter, but Jason couldn't shake the sense of unease. Throughout the day, little things kept bothering him. He heard faint whispers when there was no one around, and shadows seemed to move just out of his line of sight. The smell of something burnt occasionally wafted through the air, though there were no signs of fire. Jason's friends didn't notice anything unusual, which made him feel even more unsettled. Later that evening, Jason was at home, helping his mom with dinner. The knife slipped from his hand, clattering loudly on the floor. His mom jumped, turning to look at him with concern. "Are you sure you're okay, Jason?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. Jason nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, as he lay in bed, Jason couldn't relax. The usual creaks and groans of the house felt amplified, each sound making him jump. He stared at the ceiling, trying to will himself to sleep, but his mind kept drifting back to the demonic face he had seen. Just as he was about to drift off, he heard it again, the strange rhythmic sound from that night. His heart pounded as he sat up, scanning the room. The sound was faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere near his window. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he saw a shadow move outside. Summoning all his courage, he crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. There was nothing there, just the empty yard bathed in moonlight. He let out a shaky breath, but the sound persisted, growing louder and more insistent. It was coming from inside the house now, echoing down the hallway. Jason tiptoed out of his room, following the sound. It led him to the basement door, which was slightly ajar. His hand trembled as he reached for the knob, pushing the door open. The basement was dark, the light switch unresponsive. Jason's instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he couldn't ignore the sound, now louder than ever. He took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness, his flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. The sound seemed to envelop him, a haunting, guttural hum that made his skin crawl. As he descended the stairs, he felt a cold breeze, and the smell of burnt wood filled his nostrils. Reaching the bottom, Jason's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He felt a chill run down his spine as he spotted something in the corner of the basement. A small, charred figure, its eyes glinting in the darkness. The rhythmic sound grew deafening, and Jason's vision blurred as terror took hold. Just as the figure started to move, the flashlight went out, plunging him into complete darkness. Jason's heart pounded as he stood in the pitch-black basement. The rhythmic sound pulsed around him, making his skin crawl. His flashlight flickered back to life, revealing the small, charred figure still lurking in the corner. The figure's eyes glinted with malice, and Jason could feel its stare piercing through him. His mind raced with thoughts of escape, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. He could hear his parents moving around upstairs, blissfully unaware of the nightmare unfolding below. He wanted to scream for help, but feared drawing the thing's attention to his family. Summoning every ounce of courage, Jason took a step forward. The figure shifted, and the strange sound intensified, now accompanied by a faint, mocking laugh. Jason's hands trembled, but he forced himself to speak. "Who are you? What do you want?" His voice wavered, but he stood his ground. The figure tilted its head, the grin widening. "You invited me in," it hissed, the words slithering through the air like venom. Jason's mind flashed back to the bush, to the moment he and his friends had laughed off the encounter. Had they unknowingly welcomed something sinister into their lives? The thought made his stomach churn. "I didn't mean to," Jason whispered, his voice barely audible over the thrumming sound. The figure stepped closer, and Jason could see its twisted features more clearly. It looked like a charred child, its skin blackened and cracked, eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "You laughed. You mocked me," the figure said, its voice dripping with bitterness. "Now I'm here to collect." Jason's pulse raced. He had to end this before it could harm anyone else. He scanned the basement for anything that could help, his eyes landing on an old rusted shovel propped against the wall. Taking a deep breath, he lunged for it. The figure shrieked, a sound that echoed painfully in Jason's ears. He swung the shovel, but the figure moved with unnatural speed, dodging the blow and latching onto his arm. The touch burned like fire, and Jason screamed in agony. Desperation fueled him. He swung again, this time connecting with the figure's side. It let out a howl and released its grip, stumbling backward. Jason seized the moment, striking again and again until the figure crumbled into a pile of ash. Panting, he dropped the shovel and stared at the remains, the rhythmic sound fading into silence. Relief washed over him, but his mind buzzed with unanswered questions. What was that thing? Why had it targeted him? He trudged back upstairs, each step feeling heavier. His parents were in the living room, their worried faces snapping to attention when they saw him. "Jason, what happened?" his mom asked, rushing to his side. "Just had to deal with something," Jason muttered, not wanting to worry them further. "It's over now." They exchanged confused glances but didn't press him. Jason went to his room, collapsing onto his bed. The events of the night played over and over in his mind, leaving him restless. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, a nagging thought tugged at him. Had he really destroyed the creature? Or had he only made it angrier? The question haunted his dreams, the rhythmic sound echoing in the background. The next morning, Jason woke with a start. He sat up, scanning his room for any signs of the figure. Everything seemed normal. He let out a sigh of relief, hoping the nightmare was truly over. Weeks passed, and life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Jason's parents still looked at him with concern, but he assured them he was fine. He even managed to laugh about the whole ordeal with Mike and Tom, though a part of him stayed on edge. One night, as he lay in bed, he heard a familiar sound, the faint, rhythmic hum. His blood ran cold as he realized the truth. The figure wasn't gone. It was biding its time, waiting for the right moment to return. Jason's eyes darted to the corner of his room, where a pair of glowing eyes stared back at him. The demonic grin reappeared, wider and more sinister than before. "You can't get rid of me that easily," the figure whispered, the sound sending shivers down Jason's spine. As the creature moved closer, Jason knew he was in for another night of terror. The realization hit him hard. This was far from over, and deep down he feared it never would be. The whispering hum. Okay, so this happened to me a few months back, and it still gives me chills. I was having this nightmare where I was running through the woods, branches scratching my face, my heart pounding like crazy. Something was chasing me, but I couldn't see what it was. The faster I ran, the closer it got, and just when it was about to grab me, I woke up. Or at least I thought I did. I found myself in my bed, but I was unable to move a muscle. Sleep paralysis, they call it. My room was dark, except for the faint glow from my nightlight. Everything felt off, like the air was thicker. My ears started to pick up this strange, low hum, almost like a robotic noise, and it was getting louder. Then I saw it, a face in the crack of my closet door. It was distorted, like someone had stretched it in Photoshop. The eyes were just dark holes, and the mouth, it was twisted into this unnatural grin. Every time the noise grew louder, the face seemed to get closer. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My heart was racing, and I felt like I was suffocating. The face kept getting nearer, inch by inch, until it was almost right in front of me. Then, with a deafening slam, the closet door shut. Suddenly, I could move again. I bolted out of bed and ran to my parents' room, my heart still pounding in my chest. I woke up my dad, practically dragging him back to my room. "Dad, you have to check the closet," I said, my voice shaking. He tried to reassure me, telling me it was just sleep paralysis, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But even after he checked the closet and found nothing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next day, everything felt off. The air in the house seemed heavier, like it was thick with something invisible. I tried to shake off the night before, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Even mundane tasks felt strange. When I brushed my teeth, the mirror seemed to warp for a split second, showing a distorted reflection that quickly returned to normal. My mom noticed I was acting weird. "Are you okay, hon?" she asked while making breakfast. "Yeah, I just didn't sleep well," I replied, trying to sound casual. The day dragged on. I went to work, but my mind kept drifting back to that face in the closet. My coworkers' voices sounded distant, almost muffled, like I was underwater. Every little noise made me jumpy. The hum of the office lights, the tap-tap of keyboards, even the rustling of papers, it all seemed amplified and menacing. When I got home that evening, the house was eerily quiet. I called out for my parents, but there was no answer. The only sound was the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Tick, tick, tick. Each tick felt like it was counting down to something. I went to my room, and that's when I noticed it. The closet door was ajar. Just a crack. I was sure I had closed it that morning. My heart started to race again. I walked over and slowly pulled it open, half expecting to see that face again. But it was empty. Just my clothes hanging there undisturbed. Trying to distract myself, I decided to watch some TV. But even then, things felt off. The channels kept flickering, showing static for a few seconds before the picture returned. And there was this strange static noise that seemed to whisper something just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but it sent chills down my spine. Eventually, my parents came home, and the house felt a bit more normal. But that night, as I lay in bed, the hum started again. Faint at first, but growing louder. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to will it away, but the sound persisted. And then I felt it, like someone was watching me. I didn't dare open my eyes. I just lay there, paralyzed with fear, hoping it was just my imagination. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound kept me on edge, my mind replaying the events over and over. My dad came into my room, probably noticing the light under my door. "Are you okay, bud?" he asked, sitting on the edge of my bed. "Yeah, just can't shake last night." What if it wasn't just sleep paralysis? He sighed, clearly concerned, but trying to keep me calm. "You're stressed. It's probably just your mind playing tricks on you. Happens to everyone." I wanted to believe him, but something inside me was screaming that this was different. We talked for a while, and he stayed with me until I fell asleep. His presence was comforting, a quiet moment amidst the chaos. But the peace didn't last. Around 3 a.m. I woke up again, that same heavy feeling in the air. The robotic hum was louder this time, almost vibrating through my bones. I tried to call out to my dad, but my voice was stuck in my throat. Then I saw it. The face was back, peeking from the closet, but it wasn't alone. Dark shapes, almost like shadows, started to emerge from behind it. They moved closer with each hum, their forms twisting and contorting unnaturally. Panic surged through me, but my body wouldn't respond. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. My dad was at the door, his face pale and drawn. He seemed to be struggling to move. like something was holding him back. The shadows reached out towards him, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "Dad!" I managed to croak out. He snapped out of whatever was holding him and rushed to my side, shaking me. "Wake up! Wake up!" Suddenly, everything went black. I woke up in the hospital, my mom sitting beside me, her eyes red from crying. My dad was in a bed across the room, hooked up to machines. They told me he had a heart attack. The doctors said he'd be okay, but they couldn't explain what caused it. In the days that followed, things slowly returned to normal. My dad recovered, and I tried to put the incident behind me. But one night, while I was unpacking my things after we moved to a new house, I found an old photo album in a box. Flipping through it, I came across a picture that made my blood run cold. It was a family photo, taken years ago, but there was something off. In the background, standing in the shadows, was the same distorted face I had seen in my room. I showed it to my dad, and his face went pale. He recognized it too. We never talked about it again, but the unease never left. I don't know what that thing was or why it targeted us, but one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that face. And sometimes late at night I still hear that hum. The silent scream. Richard's cousin Emma lost her parents in a car accident when she was just 10. My family adopted her, but she never really fit in. She was quiet and distant, keeping her pain to herself. When she turned 18, she moved out and fell into a rough crowd, eventually getting hooked on heroin. Years passed, and one night, she showed up at our doorstep, a shadow of her former self. My parents took her in, determined to help her get clean. We all pitched in, staying up with her during those long, torturous nights of withdrawal. It was rough, but after a couple of weeks, things started looking up. She agreed to go to rehab, and we thought she was finally on the path to recovery. One night, about a month later, I woke up to find Emma standing in my apartment. She looked awful, pale and gaunt, with dark circles under her eyes. "Emma, what are you doing here?" I asked, bewildered. She didn't answer, just stood there, staring at me with a haunted look. Suddenly, my phone rang. It was my mom. "Richard, I have some terrible news." "Emma?" "Emma passed away tonight." "She overdosed," she said, her voice breaking. I dropped the phone, my heart pounding. I turned back to Emma, but she was still there, her eyes locked onto mine. Panic surged through me, and the room spun. I fainted, crashing to the floor. When I woke up, I was alone in my apartment. I tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by the shock, but the dread in my chest wouldn't go away. The next day, we had Emma's funeral. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what had happened. They wouldn't believe me anyway. That night, staying at my grandma's house, I experienced sleep paralysis for the first time. I woke up, unable to move, and saw Emma standing beneath my bed. Her wrists were slit, blood dripping onto the floor. She looked at me with such sadness, tears streaming down her face. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place. Eventually, I could move again, and the vision disappeared. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, my mom dropped a bombshell. Emma wasn't just my cousin, she was my sister. Our parents had given her up for adoption because they couldn't handle another child at the time. The guilt and shame ate at me, knowing the truth too late. I was furious with my parents for their secret, for the pain they caused Emma. I cut off contact with them, unable to forgive their betrayal. Every year on the anniversary of Emma's death, I have sleep paralysis. Every year, I see her, crying tears of blood, and I am haunted by the memory of her suffering, knowing I couldn't save her. Richard spent the days following the funeral in a fog, trying to piece together what had happened. It felt like a bad dream he was unable to wake from. Every time he thought about Emma, a chill ran down his spine. The memory of her at his apartment and then again in his paralysis was too vivid to dismiss. One afternoon, he decided to clear his head with a walk. The air was crisp, and the leaves were starting to turn. As he strolled through the park, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind seemed charged with an eerie significance. He shrugged it off as paranoia, but the unease lingered. Back at his apartment, things started to get strange. Richard noticed small changes. Objects weren't where he left them. His keys would move from the kitchen counter to the coffee table. The TV would turn on by itself, flickering to static before he switched it off. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just forgetful. Perhaps there was a glitch with the TV, but the explanations felt hollow. One night, as he was brushing his teeth, he caught something in the corner of his eye. In the foggy bathroom mirror, for just a split second, he saw Emma standing behind him. He spun around, but there was no one there. His heart pounded in his chest and he gripped the sink, trying to steady his breath. The next morning, he woke up feeling drained, like he hadn't slept at all. He called his mom, hoping for some comfort, but their conversation was strained. "You doing okay, Mom?" he asked. "I'm managing," she replied. There was a pause. "You know, sometimes I feel like I hear her voice, like she's trying to tell me something." Richard's blood ran cold. "Yeah," he said, attempting to keep his voice steady. "Me too." That evening, as Richard was making dinner, he heard a faint knock on the door. He opened it to find no one there, but a cold draft swept into the room, carrying a faint, familiar scent, Emma's perfume. It was impossible, but unmistakable. He closed the door, heart racing. He sat down to eat, but had no appetite. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside seemed amplified, a constant reminder that something was terribly wrong. He tried to watch TV to distract himself, but the screen flickered to static again, and this time, a faint outline of Emma's face appeared before it vanished. Richard turned the TV off and sat in the dark, feeling the walls close in. That night, he woke up to the sound of soft crying. He lay still, listening, trying to pinpoint the source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The crying grew louder, more desperate. He bolted upright, drenched in sweat. The room was silent, but he could still feel the echo of that heart-wrenching sobbing. Richard knew he couldn't go on like this. He had to understand what was happening, to find some way to make it stop. But deep down, he feared the truth was something he wasn't ready to face. As he lay back down, he was unable to shake the feeling that Emma was still with him, trapped between worlds, reaching out for help he didn't know how to give. Richard felt the weight of Emma's presence more each day, a constant shadow in his life. The eerie incidents escalated. One night, he woke to find Emma's journal on his nightstand, a book he hadn't seen since she moved out years ago. It was open to a page detailing her pain, her loneliness, and her struggle with addiction. Richard's heart broke all over again as he read her words. The next morning, he decided he needed answers. He called his mom, desperate for more information about Emma's life before she came to live with them. "Mom, I need to know everything about Emma's past. What happened before she came to us?" His mom sighed heavily. "Richard, there are things we kept from you for a reason, but you deserve the truth. Emma's early years were traumatic. She was neglected and abused by her biological parents. When they died, she was severely damaged. We tried our best, but I guess it wasn't enough." Richard's mind raced. He felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and guilt. "Why didn't you tell me? I could have helped her more. I could have been there for her. We thought we were protecting you," his mom said softly. "But maybe we were wrong." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, haunted by thoughts of Emma's suffering. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he fell into a fitful sleep. Once again, he experienced sleep paralysis. Emma stood beneath his bed, her eyes filled with sorrow and accusation. She raised her arms, revealing the deep, bloody slits on her wrists. "Why didn't you save me, Richard?" she whispered. Richard struggled to speak, to move, but he was trapped. Finally, he forced out the words, "I'm sorry, Emma. I'm so sorry." The room suddenly grew cold, and Emma's expression softened. She stepped closer, her form becoming more solid, more real. "You were always my protector, Richard. Even when I pushed you away, you tried. But I needed you to know the truth." Richard woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The room was still, but the chill lingered. He knew what he had to do. He needed to confront his parents, to fully understand Emma's past and lay her spirit to rest. The next day, Richard drove to his parents' house. The tension was palpable as he walked in. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm. His parents exchanged nervous glances but nodded. They sat down, and Richard didn't waste any time. "I saw Emma. She's been haunting me. I must know everything. No more secrets." His mom took a deep breath. "Emma was your sister. We gave her up because we couldn't handle another child with our financial situation. When her adoptive parents died, we felt it was our duty to take her in." Richard's dad added, "We thought we could help her heal, but the damage was too deep. We failed her." Richard felt a surge of anger. "You should have told me. Maybe together we could have saved her." As they talked, the pieces began to fit together. Emma had felt abandoned by her biological family and betrayed by the ones who took her in. Her pain had festered, leading her down a dark path. That night, Richard returned home, hoping for some peace. But as he drifted off, the familiar paralysis set in. Emma appeared again, but this time, she wasn't alone. A young girl stood beside her, looking just like Emma but younger, innocent. Richard realized with a start that this was Emma's daughter, a child he never knew existed. "Help her, Richard," Emma whispered. "Don't let her suffer like I did." The next morning, Richard woke with a new sense of purpose. He began to investigate Emma's life more deeply, discovering that she had a daughter who had been placed in foster care. He vowed to find her and give her the life Emma never had. Years later, on the anniversary of Emma's death, Richard still experiences sleep paralysis. But now, instead of seeing Emma in pain, he sees her smiling, her daughter by her side. Richard knows he can't change the past, but he can honor Emma's memory by protecting her child. And with that, he finds a measure of peace, knowing he's finally making things right. The Pond Secret. Rachel had always brushed off the whispers about sleep paralysis. Growing up, her nights were often interrupted by the sensation of being pinned to her bed, a dark figure looming just unreachable. Over time, she had come to accept these episodes as her mind playing tricks on her, dismissing the hallucinations as nothing more than nightmares. But moving to the new house on the island of Hawaii was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to leave the sleepless nights behind. The house, nestled near a deep pond, was a steal. The real estate agent had mentioned the rumors about it being haunted, but Rachel didn't believe in ghosts. A little superstition wasn't going to scare her away from such a good deal. So, she moved in, unpacked her things, and started to settle into her new life in the quiet village. A few weeks in, a snowstorm hit the island, an unusual but not unheard of event. The power went out, plunging the house into complete darkness. Rachel, exhausted from unpacking, decided to call it an early night. She crawled into bed, pulling the blankets up tight against the cold. As sleep took over, she slipped into that familiar, dreaded state of paralysis. She awoke to a faint tapping at the window. Her body, frozen in place, refused to respond as she strained to see through the darkness. There, staring back at her, was a boy with pitch-black eyes and a devilish grin, his teeth unnaturally large. Rachel tried to remind herself it was just another hallucination, But this one felt different, more real, more immediate. The boy's grin widened, and then, unexpectedly, he vanished. Before Rachel could even begin to relax, she heard crying from the kitchen. Panic surged through her as she struggled to move, her eyes darting around the room. The boy reappeared, this time by the bedroom door. He moved slowly towards her, his grin never wavering, the darkness around him seeming to throb with malevolence. The minutes stretched on, the terror unlike anything Rachel had ever experienced. Finally, she regained control of her limbs, and the boy disappeared. She lay there, trembling, trying to convince herself it was over. Morning came, and with it, a strange discovery. The carpet near her bed was soaking wet. Rachel's mind raced, questioning the line between dream and reality. She decided to share her experience with her neighbors, hoping for some rational explanation. Instead, she was met with a chilling story. In 1947, a boy had drowned in the pond near her house. His body was found sitting on a rock at the bottom, eyes wide open, mouth agape, swaying with the currents. The villagers believed his ghost haunted the area, seeking to drag others into his watery grave. Rachel's skepticism wavered. The haunting story gnawed at her, making her question everything she thought she knew about her sleep paralysis. She put the house up for sale, but the rumors kept buyers away. Trapped, Rachel continued her restless nights. The boy's grin etched in her mind, a constant reminder of the eerie presence she couldn't escape. The days after the snowstorm were strangely quiet. Rachel went about her routine, but something felt off. The house, which had once seemed cozy, now felt oppressively silent. She tried to shake off the feeling, blaming it on the power outage and the unsettling night. Yet, little things kept catching her attention. First, there were the footsteps. In the early mornings, Rachel swore she heard the faint sound of someone walking around the house. It wasn't loud, just soft, almost hesitant steps. She would sit up in bed, listening intently, but the sounds always stopped as soon as she was fully awake. Then, there was the pond. On her way to town, she passed by it daily. The water was always eerily still, like a mirror reflecting the overcast sky. But one afternoon, she noticed ripples breaking the surface, even though there was no breeze. The sight made her shiver, and she quickened her pace, feeling eyes on her back. In the evenings, the house seemed to groan and settle more than usual. Rachel attributed it to the old wood and the cold weather, but it didn't stop her from jumping at every creak and thump. One night, while washing dishes, she noticed the kitchen window fogging up. She wiped it with her sleeve and gasped. Outside, near the edge of the pond, was the faint outline of a figure. She blinked, and it was gone. Her neighbors started to ask if she was okay, noticing the bags under her eyes and her jumpy demeanor. Rachel laughed it off, saying she was just adjusting to the new place. But inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. One particularly cold night, she was jolted awake by a loud bang. Heart-pounding, she crept downstairs, each step creaking under her weight. In the kitchen, she found the back door wide open, snow blowing in and covering the floor. She slammed it shut, locking it firmly, and hurried back to bed, telling herself it must have been the wind. Despite her efforts to maintain a sense of normalcy, Rachel's sleep became more restless. She started to dread the nights, fearing another episode of sleep paralysis. Every time she closed her eyes, she half expected to see the boy's black eyes staring back at her. The final straw came when she found muddy footprints leading from the pond to her bedroom window. They were small, like those of a child. She stood there, staring at them, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. It was impossible. There were no children in the village who would come to her house in the dead of night. Rachel knew she needed answers. She went back to her neighbors, hoping they could shed some light on what was happening. As she recounted the strange occurrences, she noticed their uneasy glances at each other. One elderly woman finally spoke up, her voice trembling. "That pond," she said, "it's always been strange. People say it has a way of holding on to things. Maybe it's holding on to more than just water. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. The woman continued, "Be careful, dear. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried." Rachel returned home, her mind racing. The eerie quietness of the house enveloped her as she stepped inside. She knew she couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Something was terribly wrong, and she needed to figure out what before it was too late. Rachel was unable to ignore the creeping dread any longer. The muddy footprints, the open door, and the figure by the pond all pointed to something sinister. Desperation clawed at her as she sought help from her neighbors once more. This time, they were more forthcoming, their voices tinged with fear and pity. "It's not just the pond," Mrs. Kamaka said, her hands trembling as she poured tea. "It's the house, too. People say it holds the boy's spirit, that he wanders between the pond and here, looking for her." Rachel shivered, feeling the weight of their words. The village's unease seeped into her bones, making her feel more isolated than ever. She spent her days researching, trying to find any record of the boy's death, any clue that might help her understand what was happening. Nights, however, were a different story. She dreaded falling asleep, knowing that sleep paralysis would soon follow. Her exhaustion grew, and with it, a fraying of her nerves. One evening, she called her sister, hoping for a comforting voice. "Rachel, you need to leave that house," her sister urged. "Sell it, even if it's at a loss. Your safety is more important." "I can't," Rachel whispered, tears welling up. "No one wants to buy it. I'm stuck here." Her sister's silence spoke volumes, and Rachel felt the sting of helplessness. Hanging up, she stared out the window at the pond, its surface still and unyielding. She knew she had to confront whatever was haunting her. That night, a storm raged outside. The wind howled, and the house seemed to groan in response. Rachel lay in bed, heart pounding, waiting for sleep to take her. When it did, the paralysis was instant. The boy appeared beneath her bed, his eyes darker than ever. This time he spoke, his voice a low whisper that chilled her to the bone. "Why are you here?" he asked, his grin widening. "This is my home." Rachel struggled to respond, her throat tight. The boy moved closer, his cold breath on her face. Desperation surged through her, and she managed to croak out, "What do you want?" "To be free," he whispered. "But I need you to understand." Suddenly, Rachel was plunged into a vision. She was underwater, the cold pressing in from all sides. She saw the boy, struggling against the current, his eyes wide with fear. He wasn't trying to drag her down, he was fighting to stay afloat. She felt his panic, his desperation, and then, as quickly as it began, it was over. Rachel bolted upright, gasping for air. The boy was gone, but his words echoed in her mind. She realized he wasn't a monster. He was a trapped soul, desperate for release. Determined, she made her way to the pond. The storm had calmed, leaving the air thick with tension. She stood at the edge, feeling the boy's presence. "I understand now," she whispered. "I'll help you." The water rippled, and Rachel felt a strange calm wash over her. She knew what she had to do. With a deep breath, she stepped into the pond, wading out until the water reached her chest. She closed her eyes, focusing on the boy's face, and let herself sink. When she emerged, gasping for breath, she felt different, lighter. The house, too, seemed to have changed. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a sense of peace. Rachel sold the house the next week. The new owners, a young couple, were thrilled to get such a good deal. As she handed over the keys, Rachel felt a twinge of guilt, but also relief. The boy was free, and so was she. Months later, Rachel received a letter from the new owners. They were happy, but they mentioned something strange, a child-sized wet footprint they found near the pond. Rachel's hands trembled as she read, but she couldn't help but smile. She knew the boy was finally where he belonged.